Thank you very much. I'm Robert Cadeau, and I'm with Feldman, and we're from Architects Alliance. And in line with the theme of Next Cities and this symposium, we thought today we would discuss various trends that we've seen occur in the practice of the office that are a result of the growth of the city, and just some of those trends have been come out of a planned process, and some of them have really evolved in the city, as we've seen, out of an unplanned process. And so we wanted to kind of take a few projects and kind of look at those and see, in terms of the idea of next cities, how those trends have evolved and how they might evolve in the future as sort of case studies that we've seen within the office. I think at the heart of all of these situations or trends that I'm referring to is the intersection of design and intensification. And that being that as architects, we have to strive to achieve the best design possible that we can, all the while is under the challenge of intensive growth going on in the city of Toronto, under the intensification that's been happening for the last 15 years in the city. I think within our practice, it starts with housing makes cities, and that's always been a critical component of the philosophy of the office. Great cities, really the fabric that makes great cities is housing, and that is the interlocking component that makes for great streets and public spaces throughout the cities. And then within that, the special moments are the institutions as special moments within a city. But it's really about housing and making great housing. Within that idea, we are working within an environment of massive change going on, particularly in the city of Toronto. Massive change that you can prescribe in terms of numbers of 100,000 people immigrating either from the rest of the country or internationally into the greater GTA. So that's a phenomenal number of people to see coming to the city. They're coming to the city as it's a great employment center. It's an urban attractor, and for some time, although not necessarily anymore, it was relatively affordable and provided a very good lifestyle as a city. So with those powers of kind of influx of population growth, we're seeing massive change occur within the city. What this is resulting in is a planning department that is under siege. And really, the planning department has acted in the city without really a framework in place. There's been the zoning bylaw and so on, but in reality, we've seen projects that have evolved in a site-specific analysis. And what really spurred that on is in 2005, the Places to Grow Act was put into place by the province, and that really superseded the zoning bylaw. And what the Places to Grow Act stated was that in order to preserve the green belt surrounding the city, to keep it as a green belt for food production and so on, that Toronto would be an urban growth center, and that urban growth, this massive influx of population, would be concentrated in the idea of a vertical city rather than a horizontal squash and spread idea. So with the Places to Grow Act, you're really seeing not a zoning bylaw that's being enforced, but a situation of an iterative process where sites are being looked at, as I had mentioned, on a site-by-site basis. And so there's a lot of negotiation that goes on in terms of creating a successful project. Out of that environment becomes political, social, and economic challenges. The political challenges are really in projects. You're seeing projects being put through a democratized planning process where councillors and the community, through community consultation processes, are being asked to make planning decisions And as lay people, they're being challenged with these questions about the future of the city and developments that are happening in their neighborhoods. Also, consequently, our social changes. We've seen in a generation the perception of living in a single-family home has transformed into the reality of living into multifamily developments. And so it's really the millennial generation that's embraced this idea of multifamily living within the city. And then there's, of course, economic challenges, the challenges of the rising cost of land, the rising cost of construction, and the rising cost of real estate, which has put a lot of pressure, economic pressure, on the viability of these situations in the city. So what I'm going to do is, Adam and I are going to do is take you through 12 projects that look at what we were referring to as trends that we see in sort of different facets of city building. And really, as I had mentioned, some of them are the result of a planning rationale, and some of them are a result of an unplanned scenario that was a negotiated process and worked through. So these areas will be heritage conservation districts, the waterfront, downtown in the Point Tower, railway seams, and what we would refer to as the future city. So just to speak briefly about the approach to the project, and particularly housing, what has evolved in terms of the development of multifamily housing is really the reinterpretation of the dwelling unit. And that's seeing the transcription of people's ideals of a single-family home and having that compressed into a much smaller space. And so the units and the buildings themselves have to be much more efficient in delivering the kind of amenity that is anticipated for a lifestyle in a city, in a unit. And also, consequently, within the collective environment of a multifamily building, there's the provision of collective amenity. These buildings have to provide a great amenity and, in turn, provide great amenity back to the city. You have to have a vocabulary that is compelling and appropriate to the site and to the situation, convincing an urban response to density, and really, finally, very importantly, enriching the public realm. It's very important that these projects contribute back to the public realm and help to contribute to the construction of as great a city as Toronto can be. So this first diagram is really what I was referring to when we talked about the provincial policy of the Places to Grow Act. And what this shows you is the green belt surrounding the GTA. All of that green area, which is considered the area where agriculture and food production is to be preserved. And so that really sees now the concentration of this densification of the city in the area that is centered at the center of this green belt. To give you a picture of what that has looked like physically in the city, here's an image of Toronto in the year 2000. And here's an image of Toronto in the year 2014. So in 14 years, we've seen perhaps the most astronomical, for sure the most astronomical increase in density and built form in the city versus any other time in the city's history. And consequently, also, when I talked about transforming social ideas, here is a statistic from the year 2000 where we see the percentage of single-family home ownership versus multi-unit ownership. And at that time, single-family ownership was larger than multifamily ownership. That, of course, in the same period of time to 2012, transformed to now a larger percentage of the population in the city live in multifamily dwellings versus single-family homes. So just to describe some of the catalysts of certain trends in terms of the economic ramifications that have happened and how we've seen that transform over time, you can see with this chart, and you can see, I'm not sure if that's coming in focus there, but really this is unit size versus the cost per square foot of the unit. And the bar that's rising is the cost per square foot of the unit, and the bar that is slowly falling is the size of the unit. So really the size of the units have contracted with the increase in the cost of units or square foot construction and consequently square foot price for purchase. Also, you see here the trends that have impacted, had some impact on this, which is interest rates versus the cost of real estate and incomes. So the bar that's falling from the year 1980 to 2011 plots the path of interest rates falling from 15% to less than 5%. At the same time, the price of real estate rising, and the bar at the bottom is the rise in incomes. And so incomes have not paralleled the rise in the cost of real estate. So I think that just touches on some of the thematic ideas that have impacted growth and had impacts on the economics and social perceptions that have changed as the city has evolved. And what I wanted to talk about now is start to delve into projects and the trends that have come out of the process of this intensification in the city. And so the first trend that we have seen in the office as a kind of thread of projects thematically is what we would refer to as the missing tooth or the coming danger of historic conservation districts. In many parts of the city, there are historic districts or parcels of areas that have a kind of historic fabric. And at the same time, these are areas that, with the intensification and concentration of growth in the city, they are opportunities to look for inventive ways to try and revitalize them and create opportunities for people to live in these areas, and at the same time create a kind of modern intervention that coexists with a heritage fabric. So this first project is the Theatre Park project. And this is a sliver tower that is next to the Royal Alexander Theatre. So this first project is Theatre Park, and the project was located next to the Royal Alex Theatre in a parking lot that actually used to be a playing field that was owned by Upper Canada College. And so for the longest time it remained an undeveloped parcel. Now the city prescribed what should go there would be a 8-story warehouse building with punched windows, and it would go the depth of the site. And really with the cost of that land, that kind of scenario was undevelopable in terms of that. So through a lengthy process of negotiation and redesign and so on, we developed this tower as a sliver tower. And what it really is a kind of deferential to the theater in the sense that the tower is lifted up above the fabric of the historic buildings. It's pushed back to create a forecourt off the side of the theater, and then establishes a datum of podium elements that relate to the scale of the heritage fabric. So this looks at the podium and the kind of relationship of scale of the elements. This building also has a full range of units and is mostly end user occupied, meaning it's not really investors that have bought these, but people have embraced this building, and they most of the people that live there are the people that bought the units. And as I had mentioned, there's a wide range of units, so it really represents the spectrum of Toronto. This is the base of the building, which will house a restaurant at the base, and that plaza will eventually have outdoor seating for the restaurant. and then the upper stories, which are the amenity areas for the tower, and there's a pool on the roof of this, also an outdoor pool. This is the CCBR building at U of T, which is the Center for Biomolecular Research. And really, this is a similar scenario where this parcel of land was not thought to be developable, and then the university sought to try to utilize this sliver of land to create this lab building in the center, and do it in a way that was sympathetic to the adjacent heritage buildings. And so strategically, what we did with the building is, first of all, push it back so that there's a forecourt, so that the presence of the facades of the adjacent heritage buildings are red, and that there's a forecourt created by this building. Then the building anchors onto the side of the building to the left and creates an atrium, so that the heritage facade of the building on the left becomes the internal wall of the atrium and really becomes a feature of the atrium. And then really there's a datum point with the mechanical area and then a sort of upper story of the labs. What this building, I think, also embraced was lessons we had learned from residential projects, and trying to bring the kind of amenity of those sort of spaces to these labs. So they feature kind of high, lofty spaces, floor-to-ceiling glass, and the kind of amenity of great views to the city. And then we also created a lot of these convenience stairs between floors, and a kind of mid-level cafe area and some other lounge spaces and wider corridors, so that we created a kind of architectural provision for chance encounters between students, and a kind of idea of that we could create through the circulation of the building, foster collegiality and dialogue between the students. This project is the St. James Parish Hall project. This project it's the center of the Anglican Church in the city, and with the parish hall, they really wanted to refresh their image and create a kind of an idea of transparency for them, and create a kind of perception of an open institution. And so first of all, for this project to take place, the church did a density exchange with the developer who did the Spire Tower across the street, where the air rights of this church were sold to that developer, and that tower was created kitty corner to this. And then with that preserved the height of the heritage district of St. James Park, but it also fully financed the project. So then in terms of the architecture of the project, what we did was, this used to be the back of the church where there was an asphalt parking lot, and really we created a master plan where there was a new through access from Church Street through to St. James Park. The addition component becomes much more transparent. It's also a green energy building. It outperformed its cooling load sort of prescriptions for the building. And it really creates a kind of front on what was formerly the back of the building, and sort of transforms it on all faces. This is the link back to the rear apse of the cathedral. This is looking through the link back to Church Street across the side. This is the canopy of the link and looking back at the main building. And this is looking back at the sunscreen as it links back into the apse of the church. And the other thing I'll mention about this is that we took down a 1950s addition on the back and replaced it with this new addition, because we couldn't put our building footprint anywhere outside of that, because this is actually the burial ground for 4,000 people that perished in the plague in Toronto. And so they are still buried directly outside of the site of the building. This is a building we're proposing at 34 King Street across from the King Eddie Hotel, and it's interesting in that the building is the block, and it has a heritage building at the corner, which is 2 Toronto Street, and then there are 2 1960s office buildings where we're proposing this building. And the building design, first of all, contravenes what is known as the St. Lawrence Heritage District Conservation Plan. It's a new Heritage District conservation plan that's come into place, and what it prescribes is at the spring point of that heritage building, all buildings above that for the entire block should be set back 5 meters. We have taken the approach that actually the precedent here in terms of heritage is of a canyon wall condition where we're in the financial core, and these buildings, which are very robust, were built right to the property line and go sheer all the way up. And so it is that sort of spatial experience of this street, which is rare in the city, which gives you this one moment of this experience that we chose to preserve with the massing of this building, where it sort of repeats that idea of taking the building right up, and then it establishes a datum point in line with the adjacent buildings, and then sets back a top at the top. Now, what the building is also doing programmatically is with the 2 office buildings that are being taken down, we're fully replacing all of the employment use in the building and then building residential on top of that. So it's replacing the employment space with Class A office space with higher floor-to-ceiling space, and something that's more in tune with contemporary office space in the city. This shows it from the other direction, and you really see that the facade is a kind of abstraction of the vertical pier facade that you see common to a lot of bank buildings. But we're sort of playing with it with a sort of skip-stop patterning, and then we make a very definitive incision in the facade and cut it out right in line with the heritage building to kind of make a direct visual connection to it. Here you see it looking from further back, and you see the terracing effect of the building. Another sort of trend we see in the city is the waterfront and interlacing the city with the waterfront. And in some instances, these cases on the waterfront, actually there is some planning involved in terms of the height and massing. So this is the Pier 27 project. We inherited this project. It had been zoned for 1.5 million square feet, and its plan at the time had 14-story U-shaped buildings that were closed at the back but open to the lake. So it was a kind of closed scenario of buildings that turn their back to the city. Our strategy was to instead create finger buildings that create long, slender open spaces between, created more public amenity at grade, and then transfer density to these bridge elements that span between the finger buildings and frame views out to the lake. So these are various views. This is the Waterfront Promenade. It's really the first segment of the Waterfront Promenade from Yonge Street, except that is cut by the Red Pass Sugar Building, but would interconnect with the East Bayfront lands beyond that. So here you see one of the bridge building components over the spaces, looking out to the water. And some of the bridge elements cantilever beyond the buildings. And here again you get a full mix of small units to rather large penthouses that are in these bridges spanning over the open space. There's a great degree of kind of public open space planning and landscape planning that's been put into it as well. And then this is the next phase of the project, which is this interlaced tower where really we interweave these large post-tension concrete terraces to create deep terraces on the amenity, given the great views of this location, and that would be the sort of unique feature of the building to have these deep terraces. And this is an example, which is an older project in the office, which relates to mid-rise and in part an early example of the evolution of mid-rise in the city. And we call it a new unplanned neighborhood. And this is a project called the 550 Wellington. And the 550 Wellington happens at the convergence of Bathurst and Stewart Street in Wellington, which is a very kind of complex scenario where you have the heights of buildings on Bathurst, and then you step down to a consistent height across Stewart Street. And I think what's interesting about this neighborhood is at the time when this development was happening, it was considered by the city a vestigial industrial kind of area, not really part of the downtown core. And it was really the vision of the developer, Peter Freed, who started buying up lots and developing small buildings and building upon his own kind of hype, if you will, around the neighborhood, that slowly saw this area transform until this final building, the 550, which was built, which incorporated a boutique hotel and residential units. And the building has various faces, so it has this kind of special hotel tower on Bathurst, a kind of long bar building which makes the height datum of Stewart Street, and then a series of two forecourts on Wellington which address the park and just kind of create an amenity for the building itself. I think really Stewart Street, out of that process, as there was no real planning framework for height and massing, we worked with the planner there to establish a height datum. And I think really now when you look at Stewart Street in particular, it's one of the nicer streets in the city core. And this looks at the forecourt and the entrance to the hotel. And of course, with higher buildings, you have the opportunity to create great public space up higher, and this is the rooftop horizon edge pool and deck. And I'll hand it over to Adam now. That'll carry on with some of the other trends.
Hi there. I'm Adam Feldman. So I'm just going to walk us through, if I can figure out how to, oh, that's right, that's the laser. 3 point tower projects and 3 mid-rise projects, just for John. And you'll recognize one of the sites, but you'll have to pay attention. And they're projects that are interesting to us, and they kind of relate to the initial themes that Rob talked about. So the first one, I guess, is hyperdensity in the South Core. And what we're interested in is building in the city and how that happens and the different areas and neighborhoods. So one of the more interesting ones is the South Core, south of the Gardner, where it's kind of gone out of control. So it's really this kind of future modernist zone with these massive towers. This is ICE condominiums, which is 57 and 67 stories. And some of these photos were taken by some rapscallions who broke into the construction sites but took really nice photos. But I wouldn't recommend sitting up there. Yeah. My nephew apparently knows some of these guys. And I can't condone it. And what's very interesting about it is, you know, one of the trends that Rob talked about was people moving back into the city. And, you know, this green belt has kind of helped along. You know, everyone thinks it's partly the millennial generation and kind of the shifting way people live in the city, and also a desire to move back downtown, to walk to work, to walk in your neighborhoods, you know, stop driving. And what's happened is it's led to this development, this hyper development in downtown, where you've got these massive buildings that have also been leveraged to provide other uses. So in the South Core, we've got some massive residential towers, which we think are quite pretty, that have also helped spawn and subsidize commercial development. So this project was conceived as 3 towers initially. The 2 residential towers are completed. And the third, the office building here, is going to start construction this summer. But what's been very interesting is, as you know, in the 70s, the flight to the suburbs, kind of commercial space, followed that. And now that there's this kind of moving back into the city, commercial starts have kind of come back in and offices are coming back in. And so it's creating this incredibly dynamic part of the city and really reinvigorating downtown. And that's another very cool photo that just speaks to the context, right? It's this incredibly layered part of the city with the Gardner, the rail corridors. This is actually at the foot of York Street, right near the Air Canada Centre as well. And so it's this hyper-dense, hyper-mixed-use neighborhood, and it's right on the waterfront, which you can see at the top of the slide. The next project is the Distillery District. And it's interesting for us, in part because it seems so wrong. And you know, if you kind of came to Toronto and you saw 2 towers sticking out of the most complete heritage neighborhood in the city, you'd wonder what happened. And what happened was our clients, Dundee and Cityscape, unfortunately bought the site. And it came with, well, not unfortunately for any of us, but it came with a zone density of 1 million square feet of office building. And that was an idea the city had in the early 90s to try and get someone to rehabilitate the Distillery District, which had really been rotting. It was used for movie sets. I think RoboCop, the first one, was filmed there, if anyone's old enough to remember that. But trying to find a way to get people back and to encourage development. And of course, nothing really happened, and our clients bought the site. And so the challenge we had was to try and fit in this density within this pretty sensitive area. And, you know, what we came up with was a point tower scheme that allowed us actually to free up much more of the site than in the original proposal and continue the grade-related fabric of the distillery district, the courtyards, the passageways, the small spaces that are quite intimate, and relocate the density above that, and extend the distillery all the way to Cherry Street, which hadn't actually been possible before. And what's also interesting about these buildings is just, you know, the towers act along the skyline for the city, but the podia of these buildings are really kind of much more intimate. They follow the scale, the materiality of the distillery district, and kind of these little spaces and alleyways within that. The other thing that's important to note, I guess, with your mixed-use studio is that these towers also very much help to subsidize the distillery. So the revenue that came from those helped to support the distillery district, all the arts and cultures events that were going on in there. The other thing of interest is another project, the Smart House, that's under construction on Queen Street. And this one's interesting to us because, you know, in all our projects we kind of re-examine the dwelling unit and what it means to live in the city, in an apartment, and what you need to survive. And as Rob's slides alluded to, you know, the costs for construction are going up, the unit sizes are going down just based on affordability. As everyone who's been watching the news over the past few years, you know, stuff's becoming increasingly unaffordable in Toronto. And this project was no different. There it is on the right. But what really happened is our client bought the site as, you know, and paid a lot of money because it's really the last space on Queen Street West. It, for whatever reason, was mistakenly left out of a heritage conservation district on Queen Street. And so there was a huge opportunity, and also it was an opportunity to complete the street. But, you know, so in examining this area and examining and looking at people moving back downtown, you know, it became a real opportunity to do something a little bit different. And what we did with our client was try to kind of look at what you needed to live in downtown Toronto, and also rethink, you know, there's a traditional, you know, the bathroom, the bedroom, the kitchen, and people live in their units. But this was conceived as really trying to think about what you needed. Do people really cook at home anymore with Uber Eats and everything else? Do people hang out in their units? Do they socialize on the street in the bars and restaurants and all these other things? And so what we tried to do was find a way to kind of shrink these things down. And these units are actually incredibly small. We had to redesign some of them in the building because the average size was less than 400 square feet. And they couldn't get mortgage financing for the owners. But part of it was, you know, questioning, you know, for example, this kitchen and seeing what other things you could bring in there and what other spaces you can combine and, you know, what other storage spaces you can bring in. So this is a kitchen with all your laundry, your storage, your dishwasher, everything in there, just shrunken down. And it sold incredibly well. And what we're seeing or hoping to see, you know, no one's moved in yet, is that it's helping, it's just one part of a whole revitalization of these downtown areas and making them neighborhoods as people move into the streets, move back to these, you know, the downtown core where now restaurants and shops and all sorts of things are coming back down to parts of the city that no one used to live in. And it's really revitalizing it. And now for you guys, some mid-rise. So this is actually across the street from one of your sites, or across the rail tracks. This is on Sororan Avenue. And it was recently completed. So it's just west of the rail seam that goes by the Sterling Road site. And it's interesting because, you know, it's basically the edge of the High Park neighborhood, which is an incredibly now expensive and somewhat exclusive neighborhood. And one of the issues throughout the city is affordability. And what this building did by building on a rail seam, which is in the backyard of this building, was bring an opportunity for a lot of people to move into this great neighborhood at a more affordable cost. And the idea with it was a sort of playful reinterpretation of these industrial warehouses that historically lined the rail seams. So all along here were old warehouse buildings. And what we wanted to do was kind of reinterpret that and take the kind of heaviness and the massiveness of the masonry cladding and kind of reinterpret it. So the idea with it was that it kind of floats 2 stories off the ground, and it's carved out. And I think we presented a lot of plans a few weeks ago. So this is what it actually looks like. But it's quite a beautiful building if you've kind of looked at it as you've walked by. And then onto your site, or one of them, 158 Sterling, was another interesting project that's been marketed, and we're just dealing with soil issues actually right now. But it's another interesting part about residential construction in that, this one literally subsidizes the cultural realm. So this project is a whole brownfield site. On Sterling, there's the existing 10-story automotive building, which you see in the background. And what this project allowed us to do, or our client to do, was create some residential density, which was worked on with the city, and the whole site was rezoned. But what it did was it subsidized a new gallery. So MoCA, Museum of, I guess it was Canadian Contemporary Art, now it's just Contemporary Art, is going to take over the bottom 5 floors of this building and get a whole new gallery space, which is basically going to be subsidized by the residential density adjacent to it. And within this mid-rise building, one of the things we looked at was, again, thinking about the units, but also thinking about how people live in these units and what would happen if you're sort of closer to the ground. So one of the things we were interested in is exploring sort of outdoor rooms. So what these screens provide, and behind them, in addition to balconies, they're actually enclosed spaces that are, not weather tight, so that their living spaces are expanded into the outdoors, and they have a semi-private area that kind of mediates between the interior private realm and the sort of public realm outside of that. And then the last one is a project that I spent way too many years of my life on, which is the Pan Am Athletes Village. And this one is kind of an interesting, hopeful experiment. So as Rob alluded to, most of our work and most of the projects that go up in downtown Toronto are rezoning. And what that means is, with the growth plan, the zoning bylaw in the city never got changed. So there's suddenly huge pressure to build, and the city has never gotten ahead of it. So it's a case-by-case basis that these things are worked out. But what happened with this area is, because the lands are controlled by the government, they got ahead of it. So there was a huge amount of effort, 10 years before we got involved, of master planning that got a very, very tight plan and a massing envelope that's very much mid-rise, that defined all the streets, the avenues. They focused on, making really special public areas, beautiful streets, wide boulevards. This is Front Street in the middle. I don't know, has anyone been down there? Yeah. Oh, you went on a tour. It's pretty nice granite curbs. And so it's a very interesting experiment for us, because it's also truly a mixed-use community. And what happened was, in part, the residential uses. There's 2 condominium buildings that were built to start with. We're just starting up another one right now. But what happened was it was used to leverage, there's 2 affordable housing buildings, there's a new George Brown Student Center, there's a new community center in the YMCA. So all those things were brought to bear and helped and supported by some of the residential uses, and also government subsidies. But it's truly a mixed-use community, and a master planned one at that. And that really hasn't happened in Toronto since Jamestown. And so it's a very interesting experiment to us to see how it's going to go and how it's going to fill out. And right now, it's sort of 5 of the buildings are constructed, and another 2 are 3 on the way. So it's quite interesting to see how that'll pan out. And this is just a photo of the student residence for George Brown. That was the building we did. It was developed, we did it in joint venture with KPMB and us, and then also MJMA did the YMCA, and Cadeau de Stage from Montreal did the affordable housing buildings. And this is coming soon. This is our building that didn't get built. But we thought it was an interesting typology as a sort of mid-rise, but it's also a courtyard building. And just looking at different opportunities from the mid-rise typology in increasing grade-related units. This one actually brought up the courtyard to the 2nd floor above a partially above grade parking garage, and allowed for more grade-related units. And we're just starting work on it now, but we're going to try and keep all the ideas the same. But just looking at the amenity of the space and and new approaches, and different challenges as we sort of move a bit further away from the high-rise typology. And so that's kind of the work of our office these days, and an overview. So thank you for your time, and hopefully there's some interest in that.